A reading from Hebrews. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison, as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured, as though you yourselves were being tortured. Let marriage be held in honor by all, and let the marriage bed be kept undefiled. For God will judge fornicators and adulterers. Keep your lives free from the love of money, and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can anyone do to me? Remember your leaders, those who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Through him, then, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of lips that confess his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
She sat looking down at her newborn son in grateful disbelief. She had a happy, healthy, beautiful baby boy at 90 years old. With the absurdity of it all and the deep, deep contentment that she felt, she couldn't help but let out a little chuckle. This took her back to the day that Abraham ran into the tent frantic because he had just met 3 men near the tent and swore that while he couldn't quite put his finger on it, there was something special about these 3 men. So he had invited them to rest, to gather around their table for sustenance and conversation. Hurry, we have to make them something to eat. I think that cakes will do quite nicely. Nope, not that flour. Only the finest flour will do. Now, if at this point you find yourself slightly concerned that this new pastoral resident has mixed up Genesis and Hebrews, fear not, friends. I assure you that this story in Genesis and our passage in Hebrews connect. So Sarah watches Abraham in utter disbelief as he runs right back out of the tent to select a calf for a servant to prepare for the men. Cakes and a calf. The finest flour for some strangers off the road? What does Abraham think he is doing? What could it possibly be that he senses that necessitates all of this? Nevertheless, she set herself to work making cakes for these 3 strange men sitting around her table. She had finished the cakes and she sent them out with a servant, but couldn't help but to sneak a look at these 3 men. She needed to see what all this fuss was about. So as she made her way to peek in, she heard the men ask Abraham about her by name. And then she heard them tell Abraham that she was going to have a son. A son? Don't these men know how old we are? I'm pushing 90. And she couldn't help but to let out a laugh. Then Sarah heard the voice of God speaking to Abraham about her laughter and disbelief, and she immediately realized that Abraham had been right. They had not been entertaining 3 strangers. They had been entertaining angels of the Lord, and they had had no idea. The writer, or maybe I should say preacher, of Hebrews alludes to Sarah and Abraham's angelic encounter. In the verses immediately preceding our passage today, the writer-preacher seems to end his sermon with a really great last line. For our God is a consuming fire. Whew! If that's not a great last line of a sermon, I don't know what is. But then it almost seems like he picks it back up again, except instead of a sermon, it's more like the announcements at the end of the service. Friends, let us continue in mutual love, but don't forget our hospitality ministry and our prison visitation ministry need your help. And although he has moved to this emphasis on the congregation's daily praxis, he can't help but to get a little preachy with it. This is why it matters to show hospitality to strangers. When Abraham and Sarah did it, they were hosting angels, the preacher says. This is why it matters to visit those in prison, to be in solidarity with those experiencing torture. The writer even wants them to behave as though they themselves were being tortured. His wording here is more accurately translated as though you yourselves were in body. What a concept. It isn't a matter of a silent moment in worship, but to go to them, to look them in the eye, and to see that this is your sister, your brother, your sibling, the stranger, the prisoner, the tortured, and you are members of the same body. What hurts them hurts you. What keeps them in bondage keeps you in bondage. If activist Audre Lorde had been alive while the writer of Hebrews was preaching, he might have quoted her saying, "I am not free, while any woman, person, is unfree, even when their shackles are very different from my own." We're all in this together. And I think the preacher knows the gravity of what he is telling his listeners, because this is no small task. Fear not, he assures them, for God has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. This is not work to be undertaken alone. This is done in community with one another and with God. This past spring, I took what was likely my most formative class in all of divinity school. Every Thursday afternoon, I got in my car and drove the 33 minutes from Durham to the North Carolina Correctional Institute for Women in Raleigh. My 8 divinity school classmates, professor, and I waited outside each evening to be buzzed in. Our names were called one by one to show our IDs, and after being wanded and occasionally patted down, a guard escorted us down the hall and into the yard. We walked across the cracked concrete basketball courts with nets missing from the hoops, to the cracked concrete sidewalk with weeds growing up through the cracks. The sidewalk led us along the high barbed wire fence through a gate where our portable classroom was. 9 divinity students and a professor gathered with 11 incarcerated women and their chaplain in a classroom. And we preached. Over the course of the semester, I sat around the table with incarcerated women and listened to their stories. I learned of the way the prison system dehumanizes them in both subtle and glaring ways. Whether it be only having about 18 inches of space in between their bunks, Or the doctors and nurses in the health center accusing them of lying about the pain they are experiencing, either from chronic pain issues or the cancer they are dying from. The prison system has no sight or regard for their humanity. Nevertheless, they preached. They preached sermons of hope, promise, and healing in the least hopeful of places. They dared to proclaim but God and preach the God of love, justice, and freedom in the place that tried to show them that they were not worthy of those things. Each week, my incarcerated classmates showed me hospitality. They welcomed me into their classroom to sit around their table. They showed me how to find hope in a place where I really didn't think it was possible to have any. They showed me who Jesus is, who he is, what he is doing, and who he is calling. And they showed me how to follow that Jesus and how to preach about him. They always offered a blessing over me and the other divinity school students before we left. When the time came for class to end, our professor would ask if anyone would care to offer a closing prayer. And eager to offer this prayer and blessing over the class, my incarcerated friend beat everyone else to it each week. She would close each prayer asking God to keep us safe as we drove home, with angels on our tires and angels on our steering wheels. My hunch is, though, that while there may have been angels on my tires and angels on my steering wheel, I had been in the presence of angels while I met Jesus at the North Carolina Correctional Institute for Women. Meeting Jesus in prison may seem pretty radical, but the writer of Hebrews doesn't think so. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. On the one hand, this means that what the writer has already said, that Jesus will never leave us or forsake us in this work we are called to do, is in fact true. But it also means that Jesus is exactly who he says he is. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Jesus was both stranger and prisoner. Jesus is both stranger and prisoner. And Jesus always will be both stranger and prisoner. This is who Jesus is, and these are the places where Jesus resides. This is a part of him, and that cannot be ignored. His mother and father took them up in their arms and fled Herod to live in Egypt as strangers in a foreign land. Then, about 30 years later, in the garden at night, unarmed and cooperative, he was arrested by a crowd with an excess of weapons to await trial to decide his fate, enduring unnecessary and excessive violence. This is who Jesus is. And these are the places Jesus resides. In the verses that we didn't read today, the preacher tells his listeners that Jesus was not inside the gates of the city, but he was on the outside. The preacher urges his listeners to go outside the gates to Jesus and to join him in his ministry and endure with him. Join the prisoners in prison. This is where Jesus is. Find the strangers, welcome them. This is where Jesus is. This is the work Jesus calls us to. The preacher says, go outside the gates and meet Jesus. Fear not, the preacher says, For you will not be left, and you will not be forsaken, just as your ancestors and those who have gone before you in the faith were not left by the wayside in this work. The preacher has already alluded to Abraham and Sarah welcoming strangers. And when they did this, they were well outside the gates. They had long left the comforts of their home to follow the call of God into the land of the unknown. And they met God there. In his last urging to his listeners in our passage, the writer tells the people to do good, to share what they have, because these are the sacrifices that are pleasing to God. This is the call and the work outside of the gates. In the dystopian novel Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, writing in 1993, describes the world in the 2020s, where people live only in gated and walled communities, because this is what they think will keep them alive. The novel is told from the point of view of Lauren Olamina, who is 15 at the beginning and around 18 by the end. Lauren firmly believes that they shouldn't be living behind these walls, and she just can't understand what makes the people behind the walls more important and more deserving of life than the people outside the walls. She muses that maybe if they all just shared what they have and saw each other as sisters, brothers, and siblings, there would be no need for walls. One night, the perceived safety of her neighborhood comes crashing down, and the walls around her with it. She has to learn to survive outside the gates of her neighborhood because she can no longer stay there. And as she journeys north to the land that has been untouched by development, she meets strangers in need all along the way. And as she meets these strangers, the group traveling north continues to grow. Young, old, widows, orphaned children, men, women. They do not turn anyone in need away. And Lauren realizes that she cannot go the journey alone. They need each other. Because of the mutual sharing of resources and knowledge, she and her newfound community's chance of survival grows. Maybe these people she thought were strangers were really angels all along. She cannot survive without them, and they cannot survive without her. There was never a chance of life behind those walls. It was only outside the walls that they could live. There are angels everywhere, y'all. And sometimes we miss it because we have become so bogged down with distractions and so discouraged by the world around us that we can't see the wonder and the beauty. Sarah and Abraham were entertaining angels, and they had no clue. They were just three complete strangers off the road. There are angels everywhere, beyond the gates, at the border, in the prisons, in line at the grocery store, at the gym, in the desk next to you at school, your neighbor across the street, or your office mate across the hall. And you know what? There may even be an angel sitting next to you on the pew. Don't miss your chance at entertaining angels. Let us continue in mutual love. Do good and share what we have. Look the strangers and the prisoners in the eye and see our shared humanity. Stand in solidarity as though we were all in one body, sisters, brothers, and siblings together. Our survival depends on one another. So let's go outside the gates together. And may there be angels on our tires and angels on our steering wheels. Amen.